to our panel. My name is Rosie Goldsmith, and I'm here to introduce the closing panel in these debates on Europe. It's entitled Culture and Politics and the Role of Writers. And to debate this topic, we have two very fine writers of fiction and non-fiction, adult and children's books. And they're both public figures, and dare I call them perhaps literary activists. They may prefer another term. A.L. Kennedy in England, who we almost daren't use the term intellectual in Britain, let alone European. What label do you feel comfortable with?
Oh, goodness.
Do you like being intellectual?
It's such a low bar in Britain now. That's almost anyone, because we're now run by people who can't trust themselves. I just try and duck and dive and avoid labels and just hop about and just try, and I'm a person who's trying to do their best. It's about all I could say.
I can't fit that into one sentence. Sofia Ban in Budapest in Hungary. Is it important for you to define yourself? I mean, would you call yourself an intellectual? And would that be a badge of honor for you?
Yeah, although I think this is, if we translate that into Hungarian, this is a definition or the kind of taxonomy that we, I think, inherited from socialist times. There was the intellectuals and the working class, and the peasants. Those were the three basic classifications, and I think inevitably I would run under intellectual, even though, like I said, it was used in a slightly different manner than it had been traditionally used in the West, but I think perhaps we have been traveling towards that. Yes.
Well, as you can tell, we're traveling to both Hungary and the UK for this panel, but this topic, the role of the writer in society, I think is relevant to all of us as we formulate and shape our futures after these years of major upheaval and loss. We're still in the midst of a deadly pandemic. In the UK, we face the consequences of Brexit, increased populism and nationalism everywhere. We face gender and identity issues, a mental health crisis as well. We're going through a very important Black Lives Matter debate, post-colonialism. So you could argue, who cares about writers and what they think, and what can writers do at this time? And should they even be commenting? Should anyone be writing fiction at all? And we're all watching Netflix and box sets. So who cares about reading and writing? Well, Alison Kennedy, A.L. Kennedy and Sofia Ban definitely do care. I'm going to give a little brief introduction to both these brilliant women. Intellectuals, activists, whatever they want to call themselves, whatever I want to call them, I'm going to call them intellectuals and activists. They're outspoken, they're daring European writers, all of which in the UK may be considered unusual attributes, but which fill me with great admiration. A.L. Kennedy, as you'll all know, is a Scottish writer of novels, short stories, non-fiction, journalism, radio plays, essays for TV and radio, academic, teacher of writing. She's also a stand-up comedian, which people always pick up on. It is probably the most intriguing fact. Who knows whether she's going to talk about it today. She is wildly prolific. She's written 10 novels, 7 short story collections, 4 non-fiction works, and all the rest. The most timely and most recent is a collection of short stories called We Are Attempting to Survive Our Time, which Alison actually wrote before the pandemic, but what a great title. And before that, The Fable, which I think everybody in the German-speaking and world and the rest of Europe knows as The Little Snake. Zsófia Bán is a Hungarian writer, critic, and academic. She lives and works in Budapest. She's Associate Professor of American Studies at Eötvös Loránd University, where she teaches literature and visual studies. Now, she was born and brought up in Brazil, but her family returned to Hungary in 1969. She is multilingual, as you'll hear, and writes in many different genres, as does A.L. Kennedy. Her interest in the visual arts and photography, travel, memory and trauma, as well as gender, shine through in her essays, novels, and short stories. She's openly feminist, she's gay, and she's openly Jewish. And she boldly goes against all forms of intimidation, ignorance, and aggression. And I've read a wonderful quote about her. She bravely speaks the unspeakable. Sofia's recent works include the novel Night School, a reader for grown-ups, and The Summer of Our Discontent. And it is a book of essays exploring the visual representation of historical memory. And her first children's book, which was awarded the Best Children's Book of the Year prize 2020 in Hungary, and seriously rattled the Hungarian authorities. So maybe Hungary has some answers for Britain or vice versa. So now Hungarian culture is in the middle of a major upheaval, and you could argue that Britain is too, as we struggle under the COVID cloud and the Brexit cloud. So, you know, these debates about how free is literature in a political society in Hungary and Britain and other parts of Europe, you know, and how do politics affect you as writers and other creatives. Now, Sofia, I want to start with you because I want to talk about this children's book because I think it's a really good place to start. You've been on the receiving end of some quite drastic measures imposed by the Hungarian government. But to all accounts, you and fellow writers have actually emerged stronger and more determined as a result. Can you tell us about this book and what happened?
Well, the book has an owl as a protagonist, and it's about a class of third graders who befriend this owl, and there are all kinds of different children in the classroom. There's one who comes from Transylvania. There's another one who has two moms. Another one is brought up by his grandmother, and so on and so forth. And a new girl arrives to the class who is a brown-skinned girl and who doesn't speak Hungarian, and so on and so forth. And the subtitle of the book is that you can be different. And I originally started writing this together with my daughter, without having first written it down, but then it eventually evolved into a book, and I felt there was a need in Hungarian children's literature to talk about difference, since there has been so much radical propaganda against difference of any kind whatsoever under the Orbán regime, that I just felt, without, of course, trying to be didactic in any way, and I hope I haven't been, there was something to be said about encouraging difference and throwing light on how difference can be a good thing and how it should be accepted, and so on and so forth. And because I mention in the book with literally a half sentence that one of the little girls has two moms, the book was singled out by a far-right member of parliament and torn up publicly as a kind of public performance in the lobby of the office building of the members of parliament in Budapest. So that was obviously offered as a kind of protest against this kind of discourse that supports not only gays, but also basically any kind of difference. And of course, the fact that the children welcome this new girl who has brown skin, she also had an issue with that. So it actually caused a big scandal. And previously to this tearing up of my book, she had already shredded another children's book that in which the editor asked different writers to rewrite very well-known fairy tales, which were focusing on all kinds of differences like on the situation of the Romas or poor people, foreigners, and so on and so forth.
I think what happens when we hear in other countries that books are being destroyed and torn up, I think that is one of the most difficult and unacceptable actions to accept. I don't know what do you feel about hearing this, Alison? I mean, this is, how do you feel hearing that?
Well, it's this extreme fragility of effectively what is a death cult headed by old, the International Alliance of Old White Guys. They want to continue to make money during what's left of their lives. They know about global warming. They don't care about global warming. And they're pursuing so many agendas which are utterly illogical that there cannot be any other narrative. So it's so deeply in its spine terrified that there can be no stories and there can be no difference, and their heterosexuality will disappear if gay people exist. If brown people exist, their whiteness will evaporate. If trans people exist, all of the conventional sex roles will disappear overnight and it'll be chaos. I don't even know what kind of chaos you would possibly get if that happened. And they have to keep having this endlessly repeated, not very convincing narrative about a search for ever greater purity and ever greater uniformity. And humans are not pure or uniform. So it's impossible and will always hurt people and will always collapse. So, of course, they're terrified of books. Of course, they have to burn them and shred them because they're literally terrified of words that are not their own words, and their own words aren't that great, and their own lies are not fantastic. So it's unsurprising, but it's just, they've got no new shtick. It's all, let's do Nazism again. Didn't go well the first time. Do you not have a new idea? Well, we'll do the Confederacy. Yeah, that didn't go well, and we did that. What about book burnings? That's the spectacular way to destroy a book. Oh, well, now we just got to shred them. I mean, it's so close to being so obviously pathetic that they have to grip everything. They have to grip all of the means of saying anything to anybody. But it's deeply sad.
How did you react when this happened? I mean, it has, on the one hand, as I intimated before, had some positive impact because it galvanized more people to react against these changes. Tell us what happened as a result.
Well, it was certainly a good thing from the perspective of the sales, which sort of soared immediately. Setting aside this humorous aspect, I think it does have its upside, ironically, because it just shows how important the written word can be. And of course, it also reveals the very rough culture war that is going on, happening as we speak in Hungary, which, by the way, is fairly recent, because when Orban took over government, initially it looked like they were interested primarily in economics, and everybody was happy to see that they didn't want to touch on cultural topics. But that has changed very radically in the past, let's say, five years or so, 5 or 6 years, and there's a very, very heavy and rough takeover happening as far as institutions, cultural institutions, are concerned. Not just in the sense of governing over these institutions, but in the very literal sense of taking over buildings and privatizing property that is traditionally exclusive national property. And that's happening as we speak. Only a few days ago, a new proposition, a motion for a new a revised law to be introduced, which makes this kind of privatization possible. Which is unheard of, as a matter of fact, except for, the reverse process that happened under socialism, when all of a sudden all kinds of private properties were taken over by the state. Now the reverse process is happening.
So, I mean, if the laws are being changed, to disadvantage you and other creative people and all kinds of cultural institutions, which is happening, what role can you have? What impact can you have?
Well, the obvious answer to that, I think, is to draw attention to what is going on. The problem is that there's very little opposition media, free media left, because the media outlets have also been taken over, appropriated by the government. And well, there are, of course, luckily, a few online newspapers and one radio station, and well, basically no television channels to speak of. So there is a limited space in which one can raise one's voice. But of course, there's the internet, which makes it much easier to publicize information, even without doing it in official media outlets. So that's something that wasn't counted with. That of course the internet and online platforms have had a much greater role in publicizing information, and it's not enough to simply appropriate or co-opt all the official media outlets. So I think that the role of an intellectual, in Hungary, as it has been since basically the 19th century, I think this is a traditional role for Hungarian writers, since we mustn't forget that in the 19th century, even to write in Hungarian was a political statement, as opposed to writing in German. And so, that in itself, so language has always been a very important carrier of national identity, not in the wrong sense of the word, as it is nowadays being used in politics, in contemporary politics, but it helped develop a modern national culture, and writers since that time have always had this role, which is very much a public role, even though, of course, obviously, there are some writers who refrain from taking on that role. But historically speaking, this has been a very traditional role for Hungarian writers and intellectuals.
A.L. Kennedy, listening to Sofia and the situation that they're in Hungary and the reaction to her book, how do you think the situation in Britain compares, and is there any comparison at all?
Oh, absolutely. You're just looking at stages of the same kind of. It's a different epidemic. It's an epidemic of far-right populism, which is completely global. It has a few narratives from the KGB, a few narratives from Facebook focus groups. I mean, it has very little to say. It affects different countries differently, but it's always aiming for the same thing, this incredible and impossible pursuit of of purity and monetizing hate. And obviously, I mean, intellectuals are always, whatever you want to call them, intellectuals, hopefully, they're always going to be people who've kind of practiced thinking and stepped back from things and looked at them and been able to come back with what they've thought about and to put them into decent forms of words, because they practiced putting things into decent forms of words, and hopefully people are useful. Not everybody wants to be useful. In a free society that's healthy, somebody writing any kind of writing, if you're reading them, you're practicing empathy. You're looking at somebody else's point of view. They might be overtly political. They might be not at all political, but it's having an effect on you. It is changing the world one person at a time. So never popular with politicians. It's always a little bit of jealousy, even in good times. We are not in good times. I mean, Britain as a concept, it's very hard now to talk about Britain because Britain is in the process of becoming not Britain. The situation in Scotland is extremely different now. Wales wants to be extremely different, but is very small. The situation in Northern Ireland, please God, doesn't become civil war again, but is extremely tense, and probably the only peaceful outcome would eventually be a united Ireland. I mean, there won't be a Britain. Certainly.
And you're referring to the moves towards Scottish independence, which became quite prominent, vociferous during the Brexit debate, didn't they? Because Scotland is very much in favour of remaining in the European Union. And you're Glaswegian, you're from Scotland. No, you're from Dundee.
I'm a Dundonian, but I spent many, many years in Glasgow, both towns which are very yes voting. But I mean, you know, hearing Sofia talk about writers writing in Hungarian and that being about a kind of national identity which wasn't exclusive and wasn't vicious and wasn't demeaned, there's been a long conversation about Scottish identity because, again, it was a colonised state with imposed language in a slightly different way. The result of those conversations brought about this sort of semi-devolution, and you've now got a brand of nationalism which is inclusive. And you know, if you come to Scotland and want to be Scottish, hooray, you can. That's the only conversation there is. It's a Scottish identity that's about, we all live in a country and we're trying to do the best for the country, but it's not about whiteness. It's not about straightness, maleness, dominance. Yet, you know, politicians always ruin everything. But at the moment, potentially within Europe, you would have a new little country that would join Europe and would say, well, yeah, you can do the nationalist thing because people love being from where they're from and people like to feel cozy and at home, but you want to not go crazy with it. We're having quite a nice time and doing quite well with human rights law and having clean water, and the difference in things is becoming extreme. Obviously, there's always pushback to that. But you, I mean,
as far as Scotland and England, and obviously, you know, what's happening to this country as a whole, to Great Britain as a whole, the fact that we have left the European Union has changed this country already. It was already clear how it was going to change the country. And sticking to culture and writing, what do you think the impact has been already? I mean, there have been practical challenges already coming out, you know, the fact that many writers and other artists can't get visas, you know, both ways and so on. It's become more difficult also to export and import. So what do you think that what impact has Brexit had on you as a writer?
On me as a writer, not so much, but because I knew it was coming from 2016, what I've been doing is writing increasingly for Germany and a tiny bit for France.
Is that because you think they understand you better?
Well, I particularly wanted to write a lot to Germany because every time I went to Germany, they were going, it's a bargaining position, isn't it? Everybody's doing a super smart thing. It's not this suicidal, incredibly stupid thing that we appear to be seeing. It's some kind of plan. And it seemed really necessary to really disabuse people very quickly and make sure that they had, you know, this idea of which now is the international idea of our Prime Minister as a murder clown. And I'm very proud to have rebranded him as a murder clown as quickly as possible, because he is, and he could never be trusted, and negotiating with him had to be done on the basis of, yes, but you're just going to lie, and this is kind of pointless, and we have to be a little bit playing hardball with you, because otherwise you're just wasting our time. The difficulty in this country is there isn't overt, we don't like overt things, we don't like overt censorship. So the censorship and the suppression is about the choices that the gatekeepers on publishing or on newspapers and on magazines make. And it's a financial censorship. So if you're writing gay literature, you can say certain things, but you can't say other things. You have a very narrow keyhole. If you're writing about trans issues, it's even narrower. If you're writing about Black issues, you can just say some things, but you can't be very annoyed. You can't be really upset about deaths in custody, just be a little bit upset. So, and so, certainly for myself, there are things that I can say as far as political satire, which I was saying equivalent things while we were bombing the hell out of Iraq and occupying it and creating the biggest post-war refugee crisis, since World War II. I could say that in The Guardian at that point, because The Guardian would print it, now they wouldn't. And I could say it without having security cameras and security lights outside my house because of the death threats. So now I don't attempt to, nobody said don't write for the papers, don't say this in the papers, but I know I either wouldn't be able to, or I wouldn't be able to say exactly what I want to say because it would be watered down, or I would be allowed to say what I want to say and I'd have to deal with the rape threats and the death threats. And also I kind of think we're a lost cause. We're going to have to go all the way down to the bottom now and have the full educational experience. I'm terribly sad about that, but I have not thought we were savable since the end of 2016. So I'm writing for people who have the opportunity to not follow us.
Sophia, when you hear Alison speaking like that, are you surprised to hear this from Britain?
Well, obviously, we've all been following this whole process, and of course, it's not a question of surprise, but much rather a question of disillusionment, because Britain has always been the ideal democracy, or has been projected as such, and so it's a real disillusionment to watch that sort of falling apart. Whereas since we are also in the process of having our relatively newborn democracy completely dismantled, it's very difficult not to have anywhere to look to for examples. Examples to which or ideals to which one can live up to and follow, and regard as set examples. We need to be like them. Who's them right now? We basically don't have those examples left anymore, especially if we take a look at what happened to the US under Trump, since I'm an Americanist. Well, that came as a surprise, didn't it? Although on the other hand, it didn't.
Not to blacks and black people in the US.
Yes, not really predictable. The George Floyd video was, a shock to the world, not to Black people who have been, watching this kind of scene on a daily basis. It's just a question of documentation and publicizing.
But on the other hand, in spite of that, over the last year, which of course has been a terribly difficult year because of us being in this pandemic, which has increased the problems enormously, there have nevertheless been wonderful outpourings of writing and emotion about Black Lives Matter, a lot more attention in this country on post-colonial literature and arts and statues and the meaning of museums, and all our literary and cultural enterprises have been questioned. And I think that's, in many ways, don't you agree, it's quite a healthy thing that everything is being looked at again, is being revised, probably in order to think, what can we build out of this situation, out of this time which Alison describes as reaching rock bottom? Isn't, in a purely revolutionary sense, isn't that a good thing,
Yeah, but on the other hand, not to sound jaded, but the Hungarians have this sense of déjà vu, because we've been there after the political transition. We've removed statues, we've renamed streets, we've brought down from pedestals heroes, historical heroes who were considered heroes, and we already had to go through that, and we have been going through this process again and again. If you look at Hungarian history, everything has to be revised and reconsidered from time to time, and the last time that was done in a very radical fashion was after the end of World War II, after the loss of some 600,000 Hungarian citizens who were sent to be exterminated as Jews under the rule of not just Nazis, but Hungarians. And so, everything, and something that has not been worked through very obviously in Hungarian politics and Hungarian history. And so we've had to keep doing this kind of revisions again and again, and we're still in the process. And as far as censorship is concerned, obviously, that's also a kind of déjà vu, although nowadays, as Alison said, it's been, it is done in a much more sophisticated fashion, which is done along the lines of financing or not financing, publishing or not publishing, and so on. But I think that Hungarian culture, and certainly within it, Hungarian literature, has acquired a certain amount of skill as to how to navigate within such a situation, which comes as a surprise for Americans, which probably comes as a surprise for British, but it does not, unfortunately, come as a surprise for Hungarians.
Well, I mean, both countries in the whole of Europe and the United States, we all have some wonderful writers we can talk about as well. So let's talk about writing, content, and the kind of writing that is being produced now. I mean, is this a time for fiction, or is there more journalism, non-fiction, essays, poetry being written now? I mean, Alison, what have you been writing?
All of that. This is a time for everything. People need nourishment and a place to go and a voice to hear in their head and reinforcement and encouragement and inspiration, which is what they always get from art. And writing is very detailed and nuanced and very penetrating and quite memorable. And because it's in some way narrative or its words, it fits into your narrative of yourself, your narrative of your life. So it's very powerful, which is why you look up writers. Or why you squash them or make them so stressed they can't survive. And that's always been true. We got trapped in the UK. I mean, people, we got this wonderful shine at the end of World War II, and everybody forgot that at the beginning of World War II, the Nazis were astonished that we didn't join them because we were so clearly their kind of people. And our aristocracy were very clearly their kind of people. And we had a king for a while who was a Hitler fan. And it took the whole of that war and just, initially largely not moral crusade, but self-interest, because it's, oh, you want a bit of our empire? Oh, no, now we can't go in with you because we don't share, because our Reich, the sun never set on it because you can't trust us in the dark. So, that's who we were. And we were very different in 1945 And it's taken us a long time to dismantle that and go back to who we always were, which is not really a democracy with all these underpinnings that are about being feudal, with no constitution, really no safety for the people. But all through that, you know, art is the break. When art breaks down, then the pressure goes onto the legal system. Art tells you that humans are worthwhile, and you just shouldn't kill them. Other people are as important as you. When art breaks down, then you go to law saying other people are as important as you, which is now what's being evaporated. And then you just go on to politics. And if there's no pressure from art and law, and there's no pressure from newspapers and that kind of interrogation, you're lost. So we got trapped in this idea of, no, let's question everything, but let's make everybody who has a voice at all a contrarian who's questioning things that you don't need to question. Like, do we really want to preserve human life? So why the hell is that getting an entire page of a newspaper? Yes, of course we do. Can we question something? It's useful to question. And you know, in a way, thank goodness for the epidemic, because we've all sat at home and had time to think and actually question things that it's useful to question. But we've had at least 10 years of, should we be polite to people? Is society a good thing? Does everybody need a house? What about food? Some people probably don't need food, yeah? And that has been fantastically toxic and extremely effective.
In both countries, in all countries, I mean, the arts are suffering greatly because of lack of funding as well at the moment. I mean, it's become even worse in this situation. I mean, I was looking at the survey results for the authors, Society of Authors. They came from a very good survey at the end of last year. They said 2/3 of writers, illustrators, and literary translators have suffered a loss of income, and at least half have lost at least a quarter. I mean, it just goes, you know, it's really, really bad. So I wonder, Sophia, do you know what's happening in Hungary? I mean, is it from a financial point of view just a very difficult time now to write or to be active in the arts?
Well, it's an impossible situation because, well, looking at graphs, the other day I saw a list of how much of their national income certain different governments in different countries are offering as support for the arts. Hungary is zero. Now you can imagine how I mean, for a writer, it's even you know, maybe possible to go on doing their thing, but imagine people in the theaters or in any kind of performance art or filmmaking, you know, the arts that need a lot of financial support, but of course you also need money to publish books and so on, and so to answer your question, it you know, if this pandemic goes on for much longer, not to speak of the government, this is going to destroy a lot of our cultural heritage, in fact, because there's going to be such a huge amount of destruction as far as institutions, as far as theater companies and publishing houses and so on and so forth are concerned, that it's going to be very, very difficult to redo, to reconstruct.
And I think it's not as bad financially in this country, but it is very bad. When you hear that, Alison, I mean, it's a terribly difficult time, and it's quite depressing, I think, as well. I mean, as you say, Sophia, writers can exist perhaps a little bit better than you know, people in theatre and so on too, but not entirely. You do need to pay the bills.
No, you need to pay the bills. I mean, the depressing thing, it's kind of, there has to be an effort every day not to be depressed, because it removes your energy and it lets them live in your head, and we have no time to be depressed. We're still alive. We're not in jail. here we
Yeah.
go.
Let's take some.
Every day do better and outlive them, you know. But yeah, I mean, we have tiny amounts of support, but it's targeted to punish the poor. So there are so many writers and artists who don't earn enough to pay tax, and the principal benefit that you could be on this self-employed allowance is based on how much tax you've paid. And if you've never paid tax, you know, you don't get any money because it's based on this thing that you never paid. So it punishes the weakest, which is how everything is designed. So it's the future of the arts is, I mean, artists will always produce art, and they'll just, you know, as usual, have to subsidize themselves. But you're now at the point where people don't have enough food, and it's just all clinging by your fingernails to have your kids be warm, to avoid a virus when you're doing shitty jobs that expose you massively to the virus, because they're all to do with contacting the public, and the public are all insane. It's very, very hard. We're going to lose a generation, and there'll be a flight. I mean, there already is a flight of people, and whether it's temporary or permanent.
Yeah, that loss of generation is very much there for Hungarian society. There's been a very heavy flow of especially young, educated people flowing away from the country, within Europe and without, and there is in fact already a loss of generation that we can speak of at the moment, and it remains to be seen how to what extent the next generation can be kept in place with jobs and with access to education and so on and so forth. So yeah, that's something that has already impacted Hungary to a very great extent, which shows, by the way, very obviously during the pandemic, with all our the huge number of doctors and nurses who have emigrated to other countries within the European Union, and the staff we have left is obviously not enough to face this kind of pandemic.
And of course, that was happening straight after the various walls fell as well. I mean, just after the Berlin Wall fell, it happened all over Eastern Europe. The younger generation just moved to, you know, countries they thought they could live in, you know, in a more economically viable way. So, I mean, that movement has been happening for quite a long time, I think. It's no longer an East-West issue, though, is it? I mean, that's perhaps what's changed. You know, we used to easily be able to divide cultural and intellectual life into what's happening in the East and what's happening in the West. Do you see it still as divided, Alison? Sophia, do you see your origins as being significant here as Western or Eastern writers?
I think it was always more nuanced than East and West anyway. I mean, I remember you're always looking for who can teach me what, I think. And the East, you know, I remember just after the wall came down, being a tiny baby talking about democracy to this man, I was howling with laughter and saying, well, yes, you have freedom of speech, but you're all talking at once. So you always got this kind of, you know, it's sobering to talk to Russian publishers who were risking their life to publish anything at all, when at that point I was going back to Britain where everything was taken for granted and not being maintained. It's not bad to sit as an artist and think, why am I doing this in a time when everything is desperate? Is this worthwhile? Because all of our cultural discourse is about, well, we don't really need any of this. There's already enough dance, writing's a waste of time. So we've all had an opportunity to say, why am I doing this? Oh yes, because we completely ignored this and corrupted it for 10 years. This is why we're here. Of course this has to be done. It's just hard, but it's not the worst thing. You know, I'm not a nurse in a COVID ward with no proper protection playing Russian roulette every morning, but I can talk about that, and I can be emotionally manipulative because that's my job. And if people in suits tell me that that life doesn't matter, I will come at you, and I will come at you for the rest of my life.
With words, though. I mean,
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
because
But you know,
what form does this literary activism take then? I mean, if we go back to George Orwell, I always go back to George Orwell. I mean, Orwell, you know, wrote about the responsibility of writers in political turmoil, and you know, that it was important for you to play a part. You know, and to be continually skeptical. I think that was the other, you know, the other notion he had. I mean, when you hear that, Sophia, do you feel that you have a responsibility still as a writer? I mean, how are we going to go forward from this? I mean, what kind of blueprints are we going to have? We're not just going to sit here being depressed. We have to have something to go forward. We have to have an idea of the future.
Well, I think it's inevitable, Rosie, because if you're a writer who you always write from somewhere, even if you're not writing directly about your culture or your geography or whatever, but there is a position from which you are saying what you are saying, and obviously your cultural, historical, and sociological context will have an impact on what you write willy-nilly. So you don't even necessarily need to take on this very activist role in order to reflect on the world that is around you and offering some kind of criticism. So I think even without being a political activist, which in fact many writers don't even wish to take on that role, especially not after 50 years of socialism, where it was expected of writers to practice that. For instance, just to give you a specific example, PC speech, for example, you know, the regulation of language, even if for reasons of political correctness, was very, very badly received in Hungary, and it never took on the kind of role that it has in English-speaking languages, for instance, because it was seen as yet another way to regulate language and thought. And this is something that, again, you know, we've been there, done that kind of thing, and we don't want that anymore. And so for that reason, many writers don't even wish to take on that kind of role, but they do so in their writing. So I think for an intellectual, if we want to call writers that, it's inevitable that you will impact whatever is happening around you simply by writing whatever it is you write.
Now, Hungary was and is a test case in many ways for European integration and for, you know, what we've talked about, also the, you know, rising populism and nationalism and so on too. And in many ways, Britain was a test case for European integration as well. And I wonder what, you know, in your particular countries now, what you think will happen in the future as far. I mean, Sophia, are you frightened to speak out as you have just done? Will there be any repercussions for what you have done and what you have said?
I don't think so. I mean, it's possible that my publisher won't get funding for my books as easily as earlier. That's always a possibility, but luckily we haven't yet gotten to the point where writers are being persecuted in any way, except for this kind of financial blocking that happens not only with writers, but especially with the performing arts, where it's made more difficult to do your thing. But I don't think that we're at the point yet where more serious repercussions are to be expected from the part of the government, even though while we speak, this mentioned culture war is getting rougher and tougher every day to unseen measures. Even in the context of a country that has been through many similar phases, obviously with different political agendas, but it is getting to a point where you just don't believe your ears and eyes when you read the news or listen to the news. And on the upside, I think it requires a new readiness for improvisation. New tactics have to be developed, and that's I think something positive, because you cannot rely on previous knowledge. You just have to go forward and find new and different tactics.
So, Alison, do you think something new can come out of this too? Because I'm determined to get us all out of this trough and to end. I'm not going to stay on a positive note, but on something that can give us hope, Alison.
I'm not in the trough. This has always been the gig. The stuff that's been happening to Black and brown people forever is now happening to pink people. It's not a big, it ain't new. None of this is new. The solutions aren't new. The problems aren't new. The improv is fantastic. I mean, I started my life working with different community groups, and I could not prepare because they had complex needs and chaos. And what it was, I learned, I can't control this. I have to go in prepared and knowing what my actual aim is, what my focus is, which is to give them a voice. And I show up and I improvise. And it's the same gig. We show up and we improvise. It's, if you like, it's a calling. Within a calling, there is detail and nuance. What is it genuinely that I am called to say? What are my areas of concern? What in any given day is my opportunity to do something? And it might be to just be on the streets in a march. It might be to speak at the march. I mean, I only got into comedy because I ended up doing political comedy at demonstrations. I'm not really interested in just funny. I'm interested in political funny. And it's like, what is an opportunity? And that's satisfying. It's like, okay, so I'm discovering more and more things that I can do. I'm discovering more and more things that I don't want to do, and that I can confidently say no to, so I'm not wasting my time. And that's always what you're doing just in a profession to survive. But now the profession is very pressurized because it's being pressured by opposing forces, and because you can see, in a way, it's a wonderful window of opportunity to say, yeah, I always thought this was worthwhile. When I was 5, reading gave me a place to go and a reason to keep living and a light. When I was 15, it was beginning to maybe give me the thought of a job that I could do that would make me happy. When I was 25, this saved me from endless dead-end jobs. This is a precious thing. My culture has constantly told me to apologize and recoil and fuck that. This is a necessary thing. How do I be necessary today? How do I be beautiful and necessary today? And that's the gig. And in times of high pressure, things get very simple and clear and in a way peaceful. And so you always have to step into that, because otherwise, you get depressed and then you're low energy, and you need energy, because the guys on the Adderall and the cocaine and the ego trips are very high energy.
Can I ask you both as readers? Now, as a reader, of your work, both of you. What you give me is something beautiful, and you do give me energy and joy through your writing. And I mean that so sincerely. And I've read deeply and widely in the last year, and I read for a living. But that's something I do want to bring you back to. What have you been reading that has sustained you? Sophia, to end with something you can, some recommendation or some wonderful author who's uplifted you.
I recently finished a book by Jenny Erpenbeck that I hadn't read before, and I just find it absolutely beautiful. It's in German, the title is Heimsuchung. 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 It has been translated to Hungarian as home, which it doesn't really cover, because it's a search for home, but it's also haunting. It also has the meaning of haunting, and it's the story of a house, of a summer house,
yes,
throughout different historical periods. And this wonderful author, whom I haven't yet had the pleasure to meet, but hopefully I will. And that's always something to look forward to talk to like-minded authors, or to, be surprised even by non-like-minded ones. And I found this book really astounding, and I would recommend it to all of you. And of course, if I look towards Hungarian literature, the new collected volume of essays of Péter Nádas has just been published, and that's always a source of inspiration. And since Alison mentioned comedy, that's always something that Hungarian culture has looked towards and lent on, which is humor. And not necessarily in literature, not necessarily as a form of performing, but just in terms of everyday. And I think Hungarian culture has been very strong in handling misfortunes with humor, and I think that's something that we can always rely on.
And I think so in English literature as well too, English language literature. And Alison's nodding away there. So what have you been reading, and what have you enjoyed?
Really? I went back this time last year. I reread the whole of the Lord of the Rings, because that's like a childhood friend. And it's written by a man partly during World War II, when he didn't know what the end would be. And it's truly about looking up at the stars when you think you're going to die tomorrow, and thinking the story that I'm in might have a happy ending. I'm going to keep going. It's a very sustaining book, very wise about endurance. Twitter can be a very toxic place, but if you're toxic, I block you. Really funny place. All of our lords and masters do not survive. Everybody gets the joke within 4 minutes of the thing happening. That sustains me. I'm not reading Stephen Colbert, but I am loving his musicality and his humor, and I get him on YouTube the day after he's happened. But I was sent a book. I get sent lots of books. Will you read this? Will you give me quotes? And I quite often say no, because I'm busy. But this guy, Stephen Keeler, on Sunday, I read his book, which is 50 Words for Love in Swedish. Little tiny book, basically based around 50 words that he learned when he was a young person who kind of thought that he'd like to be in Sweden, and he had the ability to go and teach English in Sweden, and mainly he was being taught Swedish by his class. And it was just that thing of, oh, I fit in this country, and I love the way they do all of these things, and I love their cakes. And that thing of suddenly discovering that when you're in a different country, by choice, you become a slightly different person, and it's kind of magnificent. And it's just such a joyous outward looking, just lovely, peaceful book about thank you to Sweden that happened to be, you know, and I remember, you know, going to Germany for the first time, going to France for the first time, and it's like, oh, I love this. I love how you do that. I love how you say good morning. And just that idea that there is no monopoly on things running really well, but there are very sensible decisions that you can take, and maybe you can collect them. Just a gorgeous little book about a thing that we've, you know, been told we have to do, traitorous going to Sweden and learning filthy foreign languages and eating cakes that aren't British and full of British pig fat and rotten fruit picked by amateurs because we have nobody to pick fruit anymore. Glorious thing, just made me so smiley.
I have to add something, if I may. What else I've been reading, since you mentioned Alice on Twitter. I've recently been reading a lot of poetry on Facebook and other online platforms, because in Hungary we have a birthday for poetry, which is the birthday of the greatest Hungarian poet, I think, and many others think so too, József Attila, or Attila József. And what people do is they post their favorite poems online, and we all share poetry. And I think that's also a source of great energy, which I find wonderful, and which, you know, is happening even during a pandemic. Poetry is always there for you to lift you. Yeah.
Well, I mean, we've all been traveling, at least on social media and virtually. I mean, we've been meeting in this way too. It's obviously no substitute for the real thing. But on the positive side, we have been able to meet up in this way, and we've been able to meet everybody watching, listening. So I'm really grateful to all of you for watching and listening to us, and especially to A.L. Kennedy and to Zsófia Bán. And yeah, thank you very much for joining us. And for all of us who are passionate about keeping Europe and our stories and our creativity and our brains alive, this is not an easy time, but sharing stories can inspire us to talk and act and remind us why the idea of Europe and as an idea in reality really matters. So thank you very much indeed.